Crazy serial killer facts that will terrify you. When police asked Henry Lee Lucas why he didn't join his partner in crime, Otis Toole, barbecuing and eating their victims, he replied, "I don't like barbecue sauce." Serial killer Richard Chase only broke into houses that were unlocked. If they were locked, he thought he was unwelcome, but if they were not, he saw it as an invitation to enter.
Barbie has a much creepier history than I thought. I'm going to show you some theories about Barbie that have been keeping me up at night, and I cover all sorts of creepy and true crime stuff, so follow along. In 2010, Barbie released a doll that had a camera on her necklace as well as a video screen on her back. This doll has since been discontinued, but there's a lot of rumors about what happened to this footage when it was recorded. So people have always theorized that the footage was collected and sold either by Mattel or by someone more nefarious. And it's been mentioned how easy it would have been for hackers to collect and sell all this data. The FBI even put out a statement about it. Barbie also released and discontinued the Hello doll, which could listen to children and respond with over 8,000 pre-recorded answers. A lot of parents worried that these dolls were potentially recording their children and then selling that data, but this doll also has really concerning reviews. Like, people say that the doll won't take no for an answer. Like, if she asked if you wanted to hear a story and then you said no, she would actually push back and then just tell you the story anyways. And the doll would also ask really specific and targeted questions about children, like how big their families were and if they had any siblings. Was this doll just collecting market data on children, or was it something much weirder? So I always thought no one ever dies at Disney. Like, even if something horrible happens, they get the person off the park so they can always say that no one's ever died there. But then I found out not only is that not true, but a law firm has compiled all of the incidents. I'm going to share a few of them with you, but if you're interested in stories like this, make sure you follow the podcast, because tonight's episode's just going to be these stories. So 2 of the park's worst accidents have both happened on the Matterhorn ride. One of them being a woman named Dolly, who in 1984 fell off of one of the back of the sleds onto the rails. At the time, these gondolas used to go into the rides, and so there was actually a family that watched her fall off onto the track. And so the family also saw as there was another car racing towards Dolly. The dad actually screamed at his daughters to cover their eyes, which was for the best because Dolly got hit hard. She got hit so hard that when EMTs arrived on the scene and were going up into the ride, there were park attendants coming down telling them not to look. And so finally, when someone was looking at the car she was in, they noticed that her seatbelt was unbuckled. But it's never been confirmed if she unbuckled her seatbelt herself or if an attendant didn't check her seatbelt well enough and it was never buckled in the first place. So one time someone did dive headfirst into boiling water at Yellowstone after a dog. In 1981, David Kirwan was at Yellowstone with a friend when his friend's dog got away and jumped into a 200-degree hot spring. People around were screaming at David to not go in after the dog, but he didn't even give it a second thought. He just dove straight in. Some people completely dissolve when they do this because the pools tend to be very acidic, which I talk about in this week's episode, but that didn't happen here. So David was able to swim out far enough to get the dog, but he realized it was way too hot, so he had to leave the dog and turned around to come back. His friend was able to pull him out, but at this point David was completely blind from the boiling water getting into his eyes. A stranger had also run over to help, and he tried to take David's shoe off of his foot, but David's skin had completely melted and started coming off with the shoe. And on top of all of this tragedy, Moosey, the dog, unfortunately didn't make it out of the hot spring. She was completely lost. And David also succumbed to the burns the next day. You'd assume at this point people know the dangers of the hot springs, but people go into them way more often than you'd think. If you have a dark curiosity about this kind of stuff, you might be interested in the episode I just did. So we know that people do fall into hot springs in Yellowstone, like the guy that completely dissolved in one in 2016. Most of these are completely accidental, but have you heard the story of Don Cressy? In 1975, a bunch of young employees at Yellowstone decided they were going to sneak out one night and go into a hot spring. And they invited Don Cressy, who was a 21-year-old chef who had worked in the park for 3 summers. But that night, Don never shows up to the party. 2 days later, a small child stumbles upon his body floating in one of the hottest hot springs in the area. So the theory at the time was that Don had gotten into the wrong hot spring while trying to attend the party with his coworkers, and he accidentally jumped into one that boiled him alive. Here's the twist, and I talk about it in the episode. Not only was that hot spring not anywhere near where the party was taking place, but his car was not at the party. Someone had fully driven him there. Everyone who was at the party said that they never saw him show up, but he must have gotten there with someone. It was eventually ruled accidental, but his friends just felt like that never made sense. He had worked at the park for 3 summers and he knew it better than anyone. He knew to not get into that specific hot spring. Okay, actually though, that's a crazy story. Kayla Unbian was just 9 years old in 2017 when she was abducted in Chicago. Her father had just won custody of her, and when he went to go pick her up from a camping trip that her and her mother was on, she was gone. Kayla's mom took her and they split, and he was pretty sure that he was never going to see her again. But then Netflix has this show called Unsolved Mysteries, and they aired an episode about children that were kidnapped by their parents. At the end of the episode, they flashed this image on the screen, and it is only on screen for 4 seconds. But then flash forward to last month, there's a person shopping in a grocery store in North Carolina, and she sees this woman in the store and she's like, that's the woman from the poster. The woman in question is with a 16-year-old girl, so the shopper runs to the front desk and is like, we have to call the cops right now. And they were right. The cops picked them up and they were able to reunite Kayla with her dad 5 years later. This goes to show that even when you're watching something really fast, your brain is still registering it and you can still use that information to potentially help someone. Okay, so I spent a lot of time reading about the dark side of Disney. And there was this period of time in the Disney parks known as the Dark Ages of Disney. It's known for being the bloodiest time in the park's history. It was a period of time from the mid-90s to the early 2000s where the park decided it wasn't going to maintain the rides anymore. They were only going to fix the rides after an accident happened, which I talk about today on the podcast, but I want to talk about specific instance. And that's the first big disaster they had, which was the Columbia ship disaster. So on Christmas Eve 1998, this ship was coming into this dock way too fast. And mind you, at the time, staff had been complaining about the ship for a while. It needed maintenance, but the park refused to maintain it. So as the ship's coming in too fast, this employee grabs a rope and ties it to this post. And what happens is the rope gets too taut, the ship keeps moving, and it rips a big metal cleat off the boat. The cleat whips around at like hyperspeed towards the crowd and hits Luan Dawson in the face. He died on the spot from a fractured skull, and his wife had to get rushed to the hospital for horrific facial trauma. It was so bad that apparently some of the people that just saw the accident happen had to go to the hospital. But in classic Disney fashion, there was a little bit of a cover-up. So these are investigators looking at the dock right after the accident happened, which you'll notice is very clean. And that's because when they arrived, Disney executives brought them all into a conference room for 4 hours while other Disney employees cleaned up the deck to make it look spotless. It was actually a while before the park had to admit fault and settle with Dawson's family for over $25 million, it's believed. But yeah, there's a lot more to the story, so check out the episode. There is no way in 1,000 years you'd be able to guess what's happening in this photo. Yes, it does look like the apartment of a former frat boy who can't decorate, but it's actually a still from the most evil reality television show to ever exist, where this man was kept in this apartment naked with no food for 15 months, while 17 million people in Japan tuned in. It's also the subject of tonight's episode, so let's dive in. So this is called Sweepstakes Life, and it was a show in Japan in the 90s. To cast the show, a group of men were told to come to a casting office with no other information. A box with a question mark was then wheeled into the room, and each of the men had to pull an envelope. This guy, Nasubi, is the guy that gets the winning slip, and this is where his nightmare begins. He was immediately blindfolded and thrown in the back of a car, where he was brought to this apartment and told to strip. This is also where he's told that anything he needs to survive needs to be won in sweepstakes that are in those magazines, meaning he couldn't eat anything until he won it, which didn't happen for 2 weeks. He wouldn't be let out of the apartment until he won 1 million yen worth of prizes, and he had no idea it would take him over a year to do so. I'm gonna have to do another part to this story, but check out tonight's episode for more. This is part 2 of the worst reality show you've never heard of, where a man was kept naked and without food in a studio apartment for 15 months. In some shots from the show, you can see how much weight he's losing. He would go really long stretches without eating. So Nasubi, this guy here, had no access to food unless he won it as a prize. But about a month into the show, he does win some rice. At one point, the rice does run out though, and he's forced to eat dog food. That's all he has. And remember, 17 million people were tuning in to every episode at this point. People actually love this show so much that they figure out where Nasubi's apartment is and they go there. But they don't like bring food or blankets for him. No, they literally stand quietly outside of the window and try to catch a glimpse of him. And the whole time, Nasubi has no idea that this is being aired on television. Eventually, producers show up in the middle of the night and grab Nasubi from the apartment because they're afraid that he'll figure out the crowds are there for him. But when they bring him to a new apartment, it's identical to the one he just left. And he stays there for another year. There's so much more to this story, so make sure you listen to the episode for the whole thing. Just when I thought I heard about all the worst cults in history, this one had to come and blow them out of the water. This is Colonia Dignidad. They were a German torture cult hiding out in the Chilean wilderness after World War II, aka Yazis. And to show you how terrible they were, let me tell you a story. As a quick reminder, if you want more info, you can check out the podcast. The leader of this cult was a known child abuser, and he wanted more Chilean boys to be brought to him. So he started a hospital in the community and used it as a trafficking system to get more children. One day, a young Chilean boy choked and was rushed to the hospital. And right when he got there, a nurse scooped him up, brought him to a room, and saved his life. But later that day, his sister arrived and asked a nurse when she could pick him up to take him home. And the nurse responded that they needed to monitor him for a few more days, which is pretty suspect in a choking case. So a few days later, she comes back and she's like, okay, can I get my brother? And the nurse tells her that he's not there anymore. And this is because the hospital had lawyers on staff that were drafting up adoption paperwork when young boys would come in. The cult was able to legally adopt boys in the community without the parents' consent, and the parents had not enough money to do anything about it. There are so many more stories about this place, and I had never heard of it before, so make sure you check out this week's episode for more info. This article recently came out about the worst disasters in Hollywood, and number one is a movie that was filmed on a nuclear testing site that gave 91 people cancer. So in 1954, John Wayne starred in this movie called The Conqueror, where he played this 13th century Mongol warlord. This movie was filmed in St. George, Utah, and this is important because you know what else was happening around St. George, Utah? 928 nuclear tests. So the area the cast and crew was filming in was full of nuclear waste. One bomb that they tested in the area emitted 20 kilotons more than the advisable amount of nuclear waste. And by 1980, they figured out that 91 of the 220 cast and crew members had developed some sort of cancer, including John Wayne, who had struggled with lung, throat, and stomach cancers until he passed away at the age of 72. So psychotic hot boy Howard Hughes produced the movie, and he felt so bad about it, he spent $12 million buying every single copy of the movie so no one could see it. And apparently he watched it every single night in the last few years of his life. But the worst part of all of this, the part that breaks my heart the most, is during reshoots, they needed to bring the soil to Los Angeles to make it look like it did in the desert. And there is 60 tons of soil in LA that is contaminated with the nuclear waste from the area. This is a good reminder to double check every single nook and cranny in your house. Because in 2019, this couple came home after a week-long vacation to see that there was a stranger living in their home. And he had most likely been living there while they were also in the house. Also, if you like these kinds of stories, you'll like tonight's episode. Upon arriving home after a week away, Josh Campbell tried the front door of his house, but there was a stranger on the inside pulling it closed. That stranger was 26-year-old Ezekiel Zayas, and yes, this is a video he left on their personal computers. The two were able to call the police and eventually get him out of the house, but that's when they saw all of the terrifying stuff he had been up to in the home. He also left them videos on their computers that included incredibly personal information that they had only shared with each other, meaning that he had been listening to their conversations. But the worst part was the knives. Ezekiel had left notes in the house about surgeries that he wanted to perform on the family, like a hand transplant. And when the couple went into their bedroom, they saw that there were knives and other utensils all around the bed. It seemed like he was preparing to do some sort of operation on them. Frogging stories are absolutely terrifying, and I don't want to give too much away, but you might be spooked by tonight's episode.